This happened to me about 3 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I'm 24 now, and at the time, I was living alone in this old 2-story house I was renting in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. The house was built in the 1940s, so it had all those quirks that come with older homes: creaky floors, doors that didn't quite fit their frames, and this unfinished basement that I basically used as storage. I'd been living there for about 8 months when things started getting weird. At first, it was just small things that I brushed off. I'd come home from work and find a light on that I was sure I'd turned off. Or I'd notice that items in my kitchen had been moved slightly, like my coffee mug would be on the opposite side of the sink from where I'd left it, or the salt and pepper shakers would be switched around. I figured I was just being absent-minded. Working long hours at my marketing job had me pretty exhausted most days, so I convinced myself I was just forgetting things. Plus, the house was old. Maybe the electrical was wonky and lights were turning themselves on. It happens, right? But then I started noticing food disappearing. Not entire meals or anything obvious, but small amounts. I'd buy a loaf of bread and swear there were more slices left than what I found the next morning. A container of leftover Chinese food would seem lighter than I remembered. Again, I rationalized it. Maybe I was eating more than I thought, or maybe the containers weren't as full as I'd assumed. The first time I really knew something was wrong was on a Tuesday night in November. I was lying in bed around 11 p.m., scrolling through my phone before going to sleep, when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from downstairs. Not the settling sounds that old houses make, actual footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. My heart started pounding. I lived alone, and I knew I'd locked the front door when I came home from work. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed and crept to the top of the stairs, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but I could swear I heard the faint sound of my refrigerator opening and closing. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice was shaking, and I immediately felt stupid for announcing my presence if there really was an intruder. But the house went completely silent. I waited for what felt like forever before finally working up the courage to go downstairs and check. Every door was still locked. Every window was secure. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing. There was a glass of water on my kitchen counter that definitely hadn't been there when I went to bed. I always cleaned up before going upstairs, and I distinctly remembered putting all the dishes away. I barely slept that night. Every little sound had me on edge, convinced that someone was in my house. But morning came without incident, and in the daylight, I started second-guessing myself again. Maybe I had gotten a glass of water and forgotten about it. Maybe the footsteps were just the house settling in an unusual way. I decided to set up a small security camera in my living room. Nothing fancy, just one of those wireless ones you can monitor from your phone. I told myself it was just for peace of mind, to prove to myself that I was being paranoid. For the next week, nothing happened. The camera showed nothing but my empty living room, and I started feeling foolish for even buying it. But then, on the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the first incident, I was at work when I got a motion alert on my phone. I opened the app, expecting to see maybe a cat that had somehow gotten inside, or perhaps a bird that had flown down the chimney. Instead, I saw a man I'd never seen before, walking casually through my living room like he owned the place. He was probably in his 30s, average height, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. But what terrified me most was how comfortable he looked. He wasn't rushing around like a typical burglar would. He was just walking around my house like he belonged there. He disappeared from the camera's view, presumably going into my kitchen. I was sitting at my desk at work, watching this happen in real time, and I felt like I was going to throw up. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely dial 911. I told the dispatcher that someone had broken into my house and that I was watching it happen through a security camera. They said they'd send officers immediately and told me not to go home until they called me back. The next hour was the longest of my life. I kept refreshing the camera app, but the man had moved out of its range and I couldn't see what he was doing. Finally, my phone rang. It was the police, telling me it was safe to come home. When I got there were 2 patrol cars in my driveway and 4 officers waiting for me. They told me they'd found the intruder and that I needed to see something. They led me around to the back of my house, to the basement entrance I'd completely forgotten about. The basement had an exterior door that led directly outside, something the landlord had mentioned when I first moved in, but that I'd never really thought about since I only used the basement for storage and always accessed it through the interior stairs. The door was hidden behind some overgrown bushes, and I'd never even looked at it closely. But someone else had. The lock had been carefully picked, and when the officers took me down into the basement, I understood why I'd been hearing footsteps and missing food. Someone had been living in my basement. In the far corner, behind some old furniture that had come with the house, someone had set up what could only be described as a makeshift bedroom. There was a sleeping bag, a pillow, and a small battery-powered lantern. Nearby was a plastic storage container filled with non-perishable food: crackers, canned goods, peanut butter. But most disturbing was what looked like a journal, filled with handwritten notes. The officer who found it read some of it aloud, and I felt sick. The entries were about me, about my daily routine, what time I left for work, what time I came home, what I liked to eat. There were notes about my habits, how I always checked my phone before bed, how I usually fell asleep with the TV on, how I took long showers on Sunday mornings. One entry, dated just 3 days earlier, read, "She's getting suspicious. Heard her walking around last night after I went upstairs. Need to be more careful. She leaves for work at 8:15 every morning, doesn't come home until after 6. Safe window is 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Another entry made my blood run cold. "She's prettier than I thought. Watched her sleep for a while last night. She looks peaceful. I think she'd like me if she got to know me." The police told me that the man they'd arrested was named David Chen, and he'd been living in my basement for an estimated 2 months. 2 months. He'd been coming upstairs while I was at work, eating my food, learning my routines, and apparently watching me sleep without me having any idea. The officers explained that he'd been entering through the basement door, which he'd learned to pick, and had been careful to only come upstairs during the day when I was at work. But recently, he'd gotten bolder, venturing upstairs at night. That's when I'd started noticing things. The most terrifying part was what they found in his backpack. Along with basic supplies, he had a key that fit my front door. When they questioned him, he admitted that he'd made a copy using a key-making machine at a hardware store. He'd taken my spare key from where I kept it hidden under a fake rock by my front door, made a copy, and returned the original so I'd never know it was missing. He'd been planning to eventually just walk in through the front door. The police asked if I'd noticed anything else strange. And that's when I remembered all the little things. The moved items, the missing food, the lights being on. He'd been living parallel to my life for months, and I'd barely noticed. The detective told me that this was more common than people think, especially in houses with basements or attics that have separate entrances. David Chen was charged with breaking and entering, stalking, and a bunch of other crimes I can't remember. During his questioning, he told police that he'd chosen my house because it looked like a single woman lived there, and he'd been watching me for weeks before he first broke in. He said he'd never intended to hurt me. He just wanted to get to know me and thought that eventually we could be together. The whole thing was a nightmare. I moved out of that house immediately and stayed with friends until I could find a new place. I couldn't sleep for weeks, constantly feeling like someone was watching me. Even now, 3 years later, I'm obsessive about checking locks, and I have security cameras in every room of my apartment. But the thing that still haunts me the most is thinking about all those nights I went to sleep, completely unaware that there was a stranger living just one floor below me. All those times I walked around my house in my pajamas, thinking I was alone. All those mornings I left for work, never knowing that someone was waiting for me to leave so he could come upstairs and go through my things. The police told me I was lucky that I'd installed that camera when I did. They said that based on his journal entries, David was escalating, and they believed he was planning to make contact with me soon. I don't want to think about what that might have looked like. I learned later that David had been homeless for about 6 months before he started living in my basement. He'd lost his job in his apartment, and instead of seeking help, he decided to just move in with someone who didn't know he existed. The detective said that he'd probably done this before, and they were investigating other similar cases in the area. The whole experience changed how I think about home security. It's not just about preventing someone from breaking in and stealing your TV. Sometimes, the most dangerous intruders are the ones who don't want to take your stuff and leave. They're the ones who want to stay. This story comes from Sarah, a 29-year-old teacher from suburban Michigan. And it's about the night she discovered that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who live right next door. I've always been the type of person who likes to know my neighbors. When I bought my first house 2 years ago in what seemed like the perfect family neighborhood, I made it a point to introduce myself to everyone on the block. Most of them were friendly enough. The elderly couple to my left, the young family with 2 kids across the street, and the Hendersons who lived in the house directly to my right. The Hendersons seemed normal at first. Mark was probably in his early 40s, worked in construction, and his wife Linda was a stay-at-home mom to their teenage son, Tyler. They'd lived in the neighborhood for about 5 years before I moved in, and everyone spoke well of them. Linda would wave when she saw me getting my mail, and Mark would nod politely when he was working in his yard. But there were little things that seemed off. Their house always looked perfect, too perfect. The lawn was immaculate, the shutters were always perfectly aligned, and there was never so much as a leaf out of place. I'm not exactly a neat freak, but their level of precision made my house look like a disaster zone by comparison. I also noticed that they seemed to watch the neighborhood a lot. Linda would often be standing at her kitchen window, which faced my driveway, and I'd catch her quickly looking away when I came home from work. Mark would find reasons to be outside whenever I was getting groceries from my car or checking my mailbox. At first, I thought they were just being neighborly, keeping an eye on things. The first real red flag came about 6 months after I'd moved in. I was having some work done on my bathroom, and the contractor mentioned that my neighbor had come over while I was at work to ask detailed questions about what we were doing. Not just casual curiosity. He wanted to know exactly what fixtures we were installing, how much the renovation was costing, and whether we'd found any problems with the plumbing. When I asked Mark about it later, he laughed it off and said he was thinking about doing some work on his own bathroom and was just curious. But something about the way he said it felt rehearsed, like he'd been preparing for me to ask. Then there was the incident with my mail. I started noticing that my mail delivery seemed inconsistent. Some days I'd get a stack of letters and bills, other days nothing at all, which seemed odd for someone who just bought a house and was getting tons of correspondence from banks, insurance companies, and utility providers. One Saturday morning, I happened to be looking out my front window when I saw Tyler, the Hendersons' teenage son, walking up to my mailbox. I watched as he opened it, took out several pieces of mail, and walked back to his house. I was so shocked that I didn't react immediately. By the time I got outside, he was already back inside his house. I marched over and knocked on their door. Linda answered with that same overly bright smile she always wore. When I told her what I'd seen, she looked genuinely confused and called for Tyler. He came to the door looking nervous, and when I confronted him, he claimed he'd been getting their mail and had accidentally grabbed some of mine too. He said he was just about to bring it over. Linda was very apologetic and sent Tyler to get my mail immediately. He returned with 3 pieces, a credit card offer, a bill from my internet provider, and a letter from my insurance company. But I could have sworn I'd seen him take more than 3 pieces from my mailbox. I decided to let it go, but I started paying closer attention to my mail delivery. I even mentioned it to my mail carrier, who told me that mail theft was becoming more common and that I might want to consider getting a locking mailbox. The situation escalated about a month later when I came home from work to find my back gate open. I always kept it latched because I had a dog, a golden retriever named Max, and I didn't want him getting out. But when I got home that Tuesday evening, the gate was wide open and Max was nowhere to be found. I panicked. I spent 2 hours driving around the neighborhood calling for him before I finally found him 3 blocks away, just wandering around looking confused. A neighbor I'd never met said she'd seen him running down the street around lunchtime, which meant he'd been loose for hours. I couldn't figure out how the gate had come unlatched. It was a pretty secure latch that required you to lift it up and pull it towards you, not something that would just blow open in the wind. And Max had never shown any ability or inclination to open it himself. That night, I decided to check my security camera footage. I'd installed a basic system when I moved in, mainly to keep an eye on package deliveries. But one of the cameras had a view of my backyard gate. What I saw made my stomach drop. At 11:47 a.m., while I was at work, Mark Henderson had walked into my backyard, opened the gate, and then stood there for several minutes while Max ran out. But he didn't try to catch my dog or close the gate. He just watched Max run away, then walked back to his house. I was furious. I immediately called the police and showed them the footage. The officer who responded said it was definitely trespassing. But when he went to talk to Mark claimed he'd seen my gate was open and had been trying to catch Max to bring him back to my yard. He said Max had run away before he could grab him, and he'd been too embarrassed to tell me what happened. It was a plausible story, and without being able to prove intent, the officer said there wasn't much they could do beyond giving Mark a warning about entering my property without permission. But I knew what I'd seen on that footage. Mark had deliberately let my dog out. After that, I started documenting everything. I took photos of my mail before and after delivery. I installed additional security cameras. I started varying my routine so I wouldn't be predictable. And I began to notice just how much the Hendersons were watching me. Linda was at her kitchen window every morning when I left for work and every evening when I came home. Mark would suddenly appear in his yard whenever I was outside. Tyler would ride his bike past my house multiple times a day, always slowing down to look at my windows. The breaking point came on a Friday night in October. I'd gone out to dinner with some friends and came home around 10 p.m. to find my front door unlocked. I was absolutely certain I'd locked it when I left. I'm obsessive about checking locks. But when I turned the handle, it opened immediately. I didn't go inside. Instead, I called the police from my car and waited for them to arrive. 2 officers searched my house thoroughly and found no signs of forced entry and nothing missing. But they did find something disturbing. In my bedroom, on my nightstand, was a small piece of paper that hadn't been there when I left. Written on it in block letters was, "You have a beautiful home. We should be friends." The handwriting looked like it was deliberately disguised, but something about it seemed familiar. The officers dusted for fingerprints, but didn't find anything useful. They suggested I change my locks immediately and consider staying somewhere else for a few days. I ended up staying at my sister's house that weekend, but I couldn't stop thinking about that note. The phrase, "we should be friends," kept bothering me. And finally, I remembered where I'd heard it before. Linda Henderson had said almost exactly those words to me when I'd first moved in. She'd been standing in her driveway when I was unloading boxes, and she'd walked over to introduce herself. "You seem lovely," she'd said. "We should be friends." On Monday, I had a locksmith change all my locks and installed deadbolts on both my front and back doors. I also upgraded my security system and added motion-activated lights around my entire house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched constantly. That's when I decided to do something that probably wasn't smart. But I was desperate for answers. I called in sick to work on a Tuesday and parked my car a few blocks away, then snuck back to my house through the neighbor's yard behind me. I wanted to see what the Hendersons did when they thought I wasn't home. I positioned myself where I could see their house through my back fence, and I waited. At exactly 8:30 a.m., 15 minutes after I normally left for work, Mark Henderson came out of his house and walked directly to my backyard. He tried the back door handle, and when he found it locked, he walked around to the front of my house. I crept around to where I could see my front yard, and I watched as he tried my front door as well. When that didn't work, he walked over to my living room window and cupped his hands against the glass, peering inside. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. A few minutes later, Linda and Tyler came out of their house. Linda was carrying what looked like a small toolkit, and Tyler had a backpack. They walked over to my house like they owned the place, and I watched in horror as Linda began working on my front door lock with what appeared to be lock-picking tools. I called 911 immediately, whispering into my phone that my neighbors were breaking into my house. The dispatcher kept me on the line while I described what was happening. Linda was having trouble with the lock. Apparently, the new deadbolt I'd installed was more challenging than whatever lock I'd had before. After about 10 minutes of trying, she gave up on the front door, and the 3 of them walked around to my back door. That's when I heard the sirens approaching. The Hendersons heard them too. I watched as they quickly packed up their tools and hurried back toward their house, but they didn't make it. 2 police cars pulled into my driveway, just as they were crossing from my yard to theirs. What happened next was like something out of a movie. The officers detained all three of them, and when they searched the toolkit Linda had been carrying, they found professional lockpicking equipment, several keys that looked like they'd been copied, and a small notebook filled with what appeared to be schedules and notes about my daily routine. But the most disturbing discovery came when they searched the Henderson house with a warrant later that day. In Tyler's bedroom, they found a collection of items that had been stolen from my house over the past several months. Items I hadn't even realized were missing. Small things mostly, a coffee mug, a pen. This story comes from Marcus, a 26-year-old nurse who worked the night shift at a hospital in rural Tennessee. What he experienced in his own home during his days off still makes him question whether he was ever truly alone. Working nights at the hospital meant my schedule was completely backwards from everyone else's. While most people were winding down for the evening, I was just starting my 12-hour shift. And when I got home at 7 a.m., I'd have to sleep during the day while the rest of the world was awake. It took some getting used to, but after 2 years of night shifts, I developed a pretty solid routine. I lived alone in a small ranch house about 20 minutes outside of town. It was perfect for my needs. Quiet during the day so I could sleep, affordable on a nurse's salary, and isolated enough that I didn't have to worry about bothering neighbors when I was moving around at odd hours. The house sat on about 2 acres, with woods on 3 sides and a gravel driveway that connected to a rarely used country road. My typical schedule was 3 12-hour shifts per week, Thursday through Saturday nights. On my days off, I'd try to flip my sleep schedule back to normal so I could have some semblance of a social life. It wasn't easy, but it was manageable. The first time I noticed something was wrong was on a Monday morning in late September. I'd been off work for the weekend and had managed to sleep normal hours Sunday night. So I was up early Monday morning feeling pretty good. I was making coffee in my kitchen when I noticed muddy footprints on my back porch. At first, I thought maybe I'd tracked them in myself. But when I looked closer, I realized they were too big to be mine. I wear a size 10 shoe, and these prints looked like they came from at least a size 12 or 13 boot. They led from the steps up to my back door, then seemed to circle around to the window that looked into my living room. I checked the door and window. Both were still locked and showed no signs of tampering. I figured maybe it was a delivery person who'd come to the wrong house, or possibly a hunter who'd gotten turned around in the woods. It was hunting season after all, and people sometimes wandered onto private property by mistake. But something about those footprints bothered me. They weren't the random pattern you'd expect from someone who was lost or confused. They were deliberate, methodical, like someone had been specifically checking out my house. I decided to install a motion-activated security light on my back porch. It was a simple fix that would at least let me know if someone was prowling around at night. I also trimmed back some of the bushes near my windows that could provide cover for someone who didn't want to be seen. For the next few weeks, everything seemed normal. The security light would occasionally go off when a deer or raccoon wandered through my yard, but nothing unusual. I started to relax and figured the footprints had been a one-time thing. Then I went back to work for my Thursday-Saturday rotation. And when I came home Sunday morning, I knew immediately that something was wrong. My house felt different. I can't explain it exactly. But when you live alone, you develop a sense for how your space should feel. The air seemed stale, like someone had been breathing in it for hours. There was a faint smell I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, but definitely not something that belonged in my house. I did a quick walkthrough, checking all the rooms. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously out of place, but small things seemed off. The throw pillow on my couch was positioned differently than I remembered. The kitchen chair I always pushed in was pulled out slightly from the table. My bedroom door, which I always left open, was closed. I told myself I was being paranoid. Working night shifts can mess with your head, and I'd been feeling pretty tired lately. Maybe I was just forgetting how I'd left things. But then I found the real evidence. In my bathroom, hanging on the towel rack, was a damp washcloth. I lived alone, and I'd been at work for 3 straight nights. There was no reason for any washcloth in my house to be damp. When I touched it, it was still slightly warm. Someone had used it recently. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone and called 911, then got out of the house and waited in my car until the police arrived. 2 officers searched the entire house, including the basement and attic, but found no signs of forced entry and no one hiding inside. They took my statement and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but without evidence of a break-in or theft, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I change my locks and maybe install a security system. I took their advice seriously. That same day, I had new locks installed on all my doors and windows. I also bought a comprehensive security system with cameras that I could monitor from my phone and motion sensors throughout the house that would alert me if anyone was moving around inside. The next week, I felt much more secure. The cameras showed nothing but my empty house during the day while I slept, and the motion sensors never triggered. I started to think that maybe the new locks and obvious security cameras had deterred whoever had been getting into my house. I was wrong. The following Thursday, I was at work when I got a motion alert on my phone around 2 a.m. I opened the app expecting to see maybe a cat that had somehow gotten inside. But what I saw made my blood run cold. A man was standing in my living room, looking directly at the camera like he knew it was there. He was probably in his 40s, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. But what terrified me most was how calm he looked. He wasn't rushing around like a typical burglar. He was just standing there, staring at the camera with what looked like a slight smile. I immediately called 911 from the hospital and told them someone was in my house. The dispatcher said they'd send officers immediately and asked me to stay on the line. I watched my phone screen as the man casually walked out of the camera's view, presumably going deeper into my house. For the next 20 minutes, I got intermittent motion alerts from different rooms. He was moving through my house slowly, methodically, like he was conducting some kind of inspection. The alerts came from my kitchen, then my bedroom, then my bathroom. Each time, by the time I switched to that camera's feed, he'd already moved on. Finally, I saw him again on the living room camera. He was carrying something. It looked like a small bag or container. He walked directly to the camera, reached up, and covered the lens with his hand. The feed went black. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, but by then, he was gone. They found that he'd entered through a basement window that wasn't connected to my security system, an oversight on my part that I'd never considered. The window was small, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. But someone determined enough could have managed it. What they found inside my house was disturbing. In my kitchen, there was evidence that someone had cooked a meal. A pan on the stove was still slightly warm, and there were dirty dishes in the sink that I definitely hadn't left there. In my bathroom, the same washcloth from the previous week was damp again, and there were wet towels on the floor. But the most unsettling discovery was in my bedroom. On my nightstand was a small digital camera, the kind people used before smartphones became common. When the police checked it, They found dozens of photos of me sleeping. Photos that had been taken over several weeks, showing me in my bed during different times of day. The timestamps on the photos revealed the horrifying truth. Someone had been entering my house regularly while I was at work, and sometimes even while I was home sleeping. The earliest photo was dated almost 2 months earlier, which meant this had been going on much longer than I'd realized. Some of the photos were taken from different angles around my bedroom, suggesting that whoever was taking them had spent considerable time in my room while I slept. In a few of the images, I could see that my bedroom door was closed. The same detail I'd noticed but dismissed as my own forgetfulness. The police dusted for fingerprints and found several sets throughout my house, but none matched anything in their database. They took the camera as evidence and told me they'd investigate. But they also strongly recommended that I find somewhere else to stay until they caught whoever was doing this. I ended up staying with my sister for the next 2 weeks while the police investigated. They set up surveillance on my house, hoping to catch the intruder if he returned, but he never showed up. It was like he knew they were watching. During the investigation, I learned some disturbing details about my situation. The detective assigned to my case told me that this type of behavior, repeatedly entering someone's home to observe them without their knowledge, was more common than people realized. He called it residential stalking and said it often escalated over time. The photos on the camera supported this theory. The earliest ones were taken from farther away, near my bedroom door. But the more recent photos were taken from much closer, sometimes just a few feet from my bed. In the most recent photo, taken just days before I'd caught him on camera, you could see his shadow falling across my sleeping form. The detective said that based on the pattern, the intruder was becoming bolder and more comfortable in my space. The fact that he'd started cooking meals and using my bathroom suggested he was spending hours in my house during each visit. The detective's opinion was that he was building up to some kind of direct contact with me. That possibility terrified me more than anything else. The idea that I'd been sleeping peacefully while a stranger stood over my bed, taking photos, was bad enough. But thinking about what he might have been planning to do next made me sick. After 2 weeks with no sign of the intruder returning, I decided I couldn't stay with my sister indefinitely. I moved back into my house, but not before making some serious security upgrades. I had bars installed on all my basement windows, upgraded to a professional security system with 24/7 monitoring, and even got a large dog, a German shepherd named Rex, who was trained to alert on intruders. I also changed my work schedule. Instead of working 3 consecutive night shifts, I switched to a more random pattern that would make it harder for someone to predict when I'd be home. And I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. It's been 8 months since the last incident, and there's been no sign of my uninvited visitor. The police never caught him, and the case remains open, but inactive. Sometimes I wonder if he's moved on to someone else, or if he's just waiting for me to let my guard down. The experience changed how I think about privacy and safety in my own home. I used to love the isolation of my house in the woods, but now every shadow outside my windows makes me nervous. I sleep with one ear open, always listening for sounds that don't belong. The worst part is not knowing who he was or why he chose me. Was it random, or had he been watching me for some reason? Did he know my work schedule because he'd been observing me? Or was there some other connection I wasn't aware of? I still work night shifts at the hospital, but I'm looking for a new place to live. Somewhere with neighbors close by, better lighting, and no basement windows that someone could squeeze through. Because even though it's been months since the last incident, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, someone still has photos of me sleeping. And maybe he's just waiting for the right time to come back. The violation of having someone in your most private space, watching you at your most vulnerable, is something that stays with you long after the immediate danger has passed. Marcus learned that sometimes the most terrifying intruders aren't the ones who want to steal your possessions. They're the ones who want to steal your peace of mind. This story comes from Jessica, a 23-year-old college student who thought house-sitting for her professor would be an easy way to make some extra money. What she discovered in that house still haunts her dreams 2 years later. I was a senior at a small liberal arts college in Vermont, majoring in English literature. Professor Williams was one of my favorite teachers. She taught Victorian literature and had this amazing old house about 10 minutes from campus that looked like something straight out of a Gothic novel. When she asked if I'd be interested in house-sitting for her while she spent a month in England doing research, I jumped at the chance. The pay was good, $500 for the month. Plus, I got to live rent-free in this beautiful historic house instead of my cramped dorm room. Professor Williams said all I had to do was water her plants, bring in the mail, and make sure everything stayed secure. She had 2 cats, Dickens and Austin, who were pretty self-sufficient but needed someone to refill their food and clean their litter box. The house was built in 1847 and had all the character you'd expect from a place that old. Creaky hardwood floors, tall windows with heavy curtains, and this grand staircase that curved up to the 2nd floor. Professor Williams had furnished it with antiques and first edition books, making it feel like a museum where people actually lived. She left for England on a Friday afternoon, and I moved in that evening. The first few days were perfect. I had the whole place to myself, could study in the beautiful library she'd set up in what used to be the parlor, and the cats were great company. I felt like I was living in one of the novels I was studying. The house did make a lot of noise at night. Old houses always do. But I'm not easily spooked. Growing up in an old farmhouse had gotten me used to the sounds of settling wood and shifting foundations. Besides, I was too busy with my senior thesis to worry about every little creak and groan. The first sign that something was wrong came on my 4th night there. I was in the library working on my laptop when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from upstairs. Not the random settling sounds I'd gotten used to, but actual footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully to avoid making noise. I paused my typing and listened. The footsteps moved from what sounded like the master bedroom down the hallway and stopped near the top of the stairs. Then everything went quiet. I called out, "Hello?" Thinking maybe Professor Williams had come back early for some reason, even though I knew she was supposed to be in London for 3 more weeks. No response. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and went upstairs to investigate. I checked every room, the master bedroom, the guest rooms, the bathroom, even the small attic space that Professor Williams used for storage. Nothing. No signs that anyone had been there, no windows open, no doors unlocked. I figured it was just the old house settling in an unusual way and went back to my studying. But I couldn't concentrate. Every little sound made me look up from my laptop, and I found myself constantly glancing toward the staircase. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I was gathering my books when I heard the footsteps again, this time coming from directly above the library. I froze, listening as they moved slowly across the ceiling. They stopped right above where I was standing. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of someone sitting down heavily in a chair. Professor Williams had mentioned that there was an old rocking chair in the master bedroom that had belonged to the house's original owner. I'd seen it when I'd explored the house on my first day. A beautiful antique piece that she kept by the window overlooking the front yard. I was hearing someone rocking in that chair. This time, I didn't call out. Instead, I quietly made my way upstairs, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whoever was up there could hear it. I crept down the hallway toward the master bedroom, the flashlight clutched in my sweaty hand. The door to the master bedroom was closed. I was certain I'd left it open when I'd checked the rooms earlier. I pressed my ear against the door and listened. The rocking had stopped, but I could hear something else. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing that definitely wasn't coming from me. I should have called the police right then. I should have grabbed my keys and gotten out of that house immediately. Instead, I did something incredibly stupid. I slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The rocking chair was there by the window, exactly where it had always been, but no one was sitting in it. The breathing had stopped the moment I opened the door. I searched the entire room again, checked the closet, looked under the bed, even checked behind the heavy curtains. Nothing. But something was different about the room. It took me a moment to figure out what it was, and when I did, I felt sick. The bed, which I'd made that morning out of habit, was now unmade. Not just rumpled like someone had sat on it, but actually unmade, the covers pulled back like someone had been sleeping in it. I ran downstairs, grabbed my phone, and called campus security. I told them I thought someone had broken into the house where I was staying. They said they'd send an officer over to check things out. Officer Martinez arrived about 20 minutes later. He was a nice guy who I'd seen around campus, and he took my concerns seriously. We went through the entire house together, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. He even checked the basement, which I'd been too scared to explore on my own. We found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No evidence that anyone had been in the house besides me. Officer Martinez suggested that maybe I was just stressed about being alone in such a big old house, and that my imagination might be playing tricks on me. He was kind about it, but I could tell he thought I was just a nervous college girl spooked by an old house. After he left, I tried to convince myself that he was right. Maybe I was just stressed. Maybe the footsteps were just the house settling, and maybe I'd forgotten making the bed that morning. Old houses can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone. But I couldn't explain away what happened next. I decided to sleep in the guest room instead of going back to my dorm. I figured if I was going to be house sitting, I should actually stay in the house, and I didn't want to admit to Professor Williams that I'd gotten spooked on my fourth night. I was lying in the guest room bed around 2 a.m., finally starting to drift off to sleep, when I heard my name being called. Jessica. It was a woman's voice, soft and gentle, coming from somewhere downstairs. At first, I thought maybe I'd dreamed it, but then I heard it again. Jessica, dear. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. It definitely wasn't Professor Williams. The accent was different, older somehow, more formal. Jessica, come downstairs. This time, the voice was closer, like whoever was calling me had moved to the bottom of the staircase. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight app, then crept to the guest room door and listened. I have something to show you, dear. The voice was definitely coming from downstairs, somewhere near the front of the house. Against every instinct I had, I opened the guest room door and stepped into the hallway. I could see the top of the staircase from where I stood, and there was a faint light coming from downstairs. Not electric light, but something softer, like candlelight. "Come down, Jessica. Don't be afraid." I should have called the police again. I should have locked myself in the guest room and waited for morning. Instead, I found myself walking toward the staircase, drawn by a curiosity that was stronger than my fear. As I reached the top of the stairs, I could see that the light was coming from the library. The same room where I'd been studying earlier, where I'd first heard the footsteps above me. I started down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. "That's right, dear. Come see what I've found." The voice was definitely coming from the library now. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I could see into the room. There was indeed candlelight. Several candles had been lit and placed around the room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But what made me stop dead in my tracks was what I saw on the desk where I'd been working earlier. My laptop was open, but instead of the document I'd been working on, the screen showed what looked like an old photograph. As I got closer, I could see it was a black and white image of a woman in Victorian dress, standing in front of the very house I was in. Beautiful, isn't she? I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the room was empty. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She lived here for 60 years. This was her house, her sanctuary. She doesn't like strangers. I looked back at the laptop screen, and the photograph had changed. Now it showed the same woman, but she was standing inside the house, in what looked like the library where I was standing. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed both sad and angry. "She wants you to leave, Jessica." That's when I noticed that the books on the shelves around me were moving. Not falling or sliding, but actually moving, like invisible hands were pulling them out and pushing them back in. The candles flickered wildly, and the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. I ran. I didn't stop to grab my things, didn't worry about the cats or the plants or anything else. I just ran out of that house as fast as I could and didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove straight back to campus and spent the rest of the night in my dorm room, shaking and trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced wasn't real. The next morning, I called Professor Williams in England. I told her there had been a family emergency and I couldn't continue house-sitting for her. She was understanding and said she'd make other arrangements. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. A few days later, I went to the college library and started researching the history of Professor Williams' house. What I found made everything make sense in the most terrifying way possible. The house had been built in 1847 by a wealthy merchant named Thomas Whitmore for his wife, Eleanor. Eleanor Whitmore had lived in that house for 60 years, until her death in 1907. According to the historical records, she had been very protective of her home and had rarely allowed visitors. But the detail that made my blood run cold was in Eleanor's obituary. She had died in the library of the house, sitting at the very desk where I'd been working. The obituary mentioned that she had been found by a neighbor, surrounded by lit candles, with an old photograph in her hands. The photograph was described as a portrait of herself, taken in front of the house shortly after it was built. I never went back to that house. Professor Williams found another house sitter, and I finished out my senior year trying to forget what had happened. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I still hear that voice calling my name. Jessica, dear. And sometimes, just for a moment, I smell the faint scent of old candles and feel the presence of someone who doesn't want strangers in her house. Some houses hold on to their past inhabitants, and some past inhabitants refuse to let go of their houses. Jessica learned that when you're a guest in someone else's home, you might not be the only one staying there. This story comes from Rachel, a 31-year-old graphic designer who lived alone in a downtown apartment complex in Portland, Oregon. What started as minor maintenance issues in her building turned into a nightmare that made her question everyone she thought she could trust. I'd been living in the Riverside apartments for about 8 months when the problem started. It was a nice enough building, nothing fancy, but clean and well-maintained, with good security and a responsive management company. My apartment was on the 4th floor, a 1-bedroom unit with big windows that overlooked the courtyard. I felt safe there, which was important to me as a single woman living alone in the city. The building had about 60 units spread across 6 floors, and most of my neighbors were young professionals like me. We had a doorman during the day and a security system that required a key card to get into the building after hours. There was also a maintenance staff that took care of repairs and general upkeep. The head maintenance guy was a man named Carl Morrison. He was probably in his late 40s, average height, with graying hair and the kind of weathered hands that come from years of manual labor. He'd been working in the building for over 5 years, according to the property manager, and everyone seemed to trust him. He had keys to all the units for emergency repairs and was known for being reliable and professional. I'd interacted with Carl a few times since moving in. Once when my garbage disposal stopped working, and another time when I needed help moving a heavy bookshelf. He was always polite and efficient, though he had this habit of making small talk that sometimes felt a little too personal. He'd ask about my work schedule, whether I had family in the area, if I was dating anyone. I figured he was just being friendly, the way maintenance people often are when they're trying to build rapport with tenants. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday night in November. I'd been working late on a project and didn't get home until almost 11 p.m. As I was getting ready for bed, I noticed that my bathroom faucet was dripping. It hadn't been dripping when I left for work that morning. I was sure of that because I'm particular about things like that. I tried tightening the handle, but the dripping continued. It wasn't a major emergency, but the sound was annoying, and I knew it would keep me awake. I decided to put in a maintenance request first thing in the morning. But when I woke up the next day, the faucet wasn't dripping anymore. The handle was tighter than I remembered leaving it, and there was no sign that there had ever been a problem. I figured maybe I'd fixed it better than I thought, or maybe the issue had resolved itself somehow. A few days later, the same thing happened with my kitchen sink. I came home from work to find it dripping steadily, but by morning, it was fine. Then it was the bathroom faucet again, then a loose doorknob on my bedroom closet, then a flickering light in my living room. Each time, the problem would appear while I was at work or out for the evening, and each time, it would be mysteriously fixed by the next morning. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, or if there was some kind of water pressure issue in the building that was causing intermittent problems. I mentioned it to my neighbor across the hall, a woman named Sandra, who'd lived in the building for 3 years. She looked at me strangely when I described what was happening. "That's weird," she said. "I've never had any problems like that." And usually, if there's a building-wide issue, management sends out a notice. That's when I started paying closer attention to the timing of these mysterious repairs. I began keeping a log of when I left my apartment and when I returned, and what problems I found. A pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. The issues only appeared on days when I'd been gone for more than 6 hours, and they were always fixed by the time I woke up the next morning, even though I'd never put in a maintenance request or given anyone permission to enter my apartment. Someone was coming into my apartment while I was away, creating minor problems, and then returning later to fix them. I decided to test my theory. On a Friday, I deliberately left my apartment for the entire day, making sure to lock everything and even placing a small piece of tape on my front door frame, in a spot where it wouldn't be noticed unless someone was looking for it. When I came home that evening, the tape was gone, and sure enough, my bathroom faucet was dripping. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening for any sound that might indicate someone was in my apartment. Around 3 a.m., I heard the faint sound of my front door opening. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay still and listen. I could hear soft footsteps moving through my living room, then into my kitchen. The footsteps paused there for a few minutes, then moved toward my bathroom. I heard the sound of tools being used, a wrench maybe, or pliers. After about 10 minutes, the footsteps moved back toward my front door, and I heard the soft click of it closing. In the morning, my bathroom faucet was no longer dripping. I was terrified, but I was also angry. Someone was violating my privacy and my sense of security in the most insidious way possible. They weren't stealing anything or causing obvious damage. They were creating problems just so they could come back and fix them, giving them an excuse to be in my apartment whenever they wanted. I called the property management company and demanded to speak with the manager. I explained what had been happening and insisted that they investigate. The manager, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, seemed skeptical at first. But when I showed her my detailed log of incidents, she agreed to look into it. The only person who has keys to all the units is our maintenance supervisor, Carl Morrison, she said. But he's been with us for years, and we've never had any complaints about him. Are you sure you're not just experiencing normal wear and tear on your fixtures? I told her I was absolutely certain that someone was entering my apartment without permission, and that I wanted the locks changed immediately. She agreed to have it done that afternoon, and she also said she'd review the building security footage to see if there was any evidence of unauthorized entry. That evening, I felt safer with my new locks. I went to bed thinking that maybe the problem was solved. But I was wrong. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone trying to open my front door. The handle was turning slowly, carefully, like someone was trying not to wake me. When the door didn't open, I heard a soft curse, followed by the sound of footsteps moving away down the hallway. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering that someone was trying to break into my apartment. The dispatcher said they'd send officers immediately and told me to stay on the line. While I was waiting for the police, I heard the sound again. Someone at my door, but this time they seemed to be working on the lock itself. I could hear the faint scraping of metal on metal, like someone was trying to pick the lock. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, and I heard voices in the hallway. When I finally felt safe enough to open my door, I found 2 officers talking to Carl Morrison. He was standing in the hallway in his work clothes, holding a toolbox, claiming that he'd received an emergency maintenance call about a water leak in my apartment. I was just coming to check on the problem he told the officers. I have authorization from management to enter units for emergency repairs. But when the officers called Mrs. Patterson to verify his story, she told them that no emergency call had been made and that Carl wasn't supposed to be in the building at 2 a.m. unless there was a genuine emergency that had been reported through proper channels. Carl's story started falling apart quickly. When the officers searched his toolbox, they found not just maintenance tools, but also a small camera, several USB drives, and what appeared to be lock-picking equipment. They also found a notebook filled with detailed information about various tenants in the building, their work schedules, their daily routines, and personal details that he shouldn't have known. My name was in that notebook, along with notes about my schedule, my habits, and disturbingly personal observations about my appearance and behavior. There were entries dating back months, long before I'd started noticing the maintenance problems. Tuesday. Rachel leaves for work at 8:15 a.m., returns around 6 p.m., wears blue dress, looks tired. Apartment smells like vanilla candles. Friday. Rachel went out around 7 p.m., dressed up, probably on a date. Didn't come home until late. Left bedroom window open. Sunday. Rachel did laundry in building laundry room, wears pink pajamas to bed, sleeps on left side of bed. The entries went on and on, documenting my life in horrifying detail. It was clear that Carl had been entering my apartment regularly for months, not just to create and fix maintenance problems, but to observe me, to learn my routines, and apparently to take photos and videos of me, without my knowledge. When the police searched Carl's own apartment, they found hundreds of photos and videos of female tenants in the building, taken without their knowledge in their own homes. Some of the images showed women sleeping, showering, or in various states of undress. He had been systematically violating the privacy of multiple women in the building for years. The USB drives contained even more disturbing content. Videos of Carl moving through apartments while the tenants were away, going through their personal belongings, their underwear drawers, their medicine cabinets. In some videos, he could be seen lying on their beds, using their bathrooms, even eating their food. Carl Morrison was arrested and charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering, voyeurism, stalking, and invasion of privacy. During his interrogation, he admitted that he'd been using his position as maintenance supervisor to gain access to apartments for years. He said he'd started with just entering units to look around when tenants were away, but had gradually escalated to installing hidden cameras and creating fake maintenance problems as excuses to return. The fake maintenance issues were his way of testing whether tenants were paying attention to their living spaces. If someone didn't notice or complain about a dripping faucet or a loose doorknob, he knew they weren't very observant, which made them better targets for his more invasive activities. The investigation revealed that Carl had been targeting single women almost exclusively, and that he'd developed detailed profiles of their habits and vulnerabilities. Some of the women he'd been watching had no idea they were being victimized. Their apartments had been entered dozens of times without them ever noticing. The property management company faced multiple lawsuits from tenants who had been violated by Carl's actions. Mrs. Patterson was fired for failing to properly supervise her staff and for not taking my initial complaints seriously enough. The entire building had to have its locks changed, and new security protocols were put in place. But for me, the damage was already done. I couldn't stay in that apartment, knowing that someone had been watching me sleep, going through my personal belongings, and documenting my most private moments. I moved out within a week of Carl's arrest and found a new place across town. Even now, 2 years later, I'm hypervigilant about home security. I change my locks regularly. I have multiple security cameras in my apartment, and I never trust maintenance workers completely. I've learned to pay attention to small details that might indicate someone has been in my space without permission. The worst part is knowing how long it went on without me realizing it. Carl had been violating my privacy for months before I started noticing the fake maintenance problems. How many times had he been in my apartment while I slept? How many photos did he take? How many times did he watch me through hidden cameras? Those are questions I'll never have answers to. And that uncertainty is almost worse than knowing the truth would be. Carl Morrison was sentenced to 8 years in prison. But that doesn't undo the violation that Rachel and the other women experienced. Sometimes the people we trust most, the ones with legitimate access to our homes, are the ones we should fear the most. This story comes from David, a 28-year-old software engineer who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside of Denver, Colorado. What he thought was a simple case of mistaken identity turned into something far more sinister and personal. I've always been a heavy sleeper. Growing up, my family used to joke that a marching band could parade through my bedroom and I wouldn't wake up. It's a trait that served me well in college dorms and shared apartments. But living alone in my own house, I started to wonder if maybe it wasn't such a good thing after all. I'd bought the house about 6 months earlier, a modest 2-story colonial in a neighborhood called Maple Heights. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors. Kids rode bikes in the streets. And the biggest crime was usually someone forgetting to bring in their garbage cans. Perfect for a guy like me who worked from home and valued peace and quiet. The house came with a basic security system that the previous owners had installed, but I'd never bothered to set it. The neighborhood felt safe, and I figured I was being overly cautious, even considering it. Besides, I had good locks on all the doors and windows, and my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was one of those people who seemed to notice everything that happened on the block. The first incident happened on a Thursday morning in late October. I woke up around 7 a.m., feeling unusually groggy, like I'd had a really restless night, even though I couldn't remember waking up at all. As I was getting ready for my morning coffee, I noticed that my front door was unlocked. That was strange, because I'm obsessive about locking doors before bed. It's one of those habits that's so ingrained I do it automatically, like brushing my teeth. But when I checked the door that morning, the deadbolt was turned and the chain wasn't engaged. I figured maybe I'd been more tired than usual the night before and had forgotten to lock up properly. It happens to everyone sometimes, right? I made a mental note to be more careful and went about my day. But then I found the muddy footprints. They were on my kitchen floor, leading from the back door to the refrigerator and then back toward the living room. The prints were definitely not mine. They were from boots, and I'd been wearing sneakers the day before. They were also much larger than my feet, probably a size 12 or 13. I followed the trail through my house, and what I found made my stomach drop. The footprints led upstairs to my bedroom, where they stopped right beside my bed. There were muddy boot prints on my carpet, just inches from where I'd been sleeping. Someone had been in my house while I slept. They'd walked through my kitchen, up to my bedroom, and stood next to my bed while I was unconscious and vulnerable. I called the police immediately. 2 officers came out and took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. Nothing had been stolen, there were no signs of forced entry, and the footprints, while disturbing, weren't enough evidence to launch a major investigation. They suggested I install better security and be more careful about locking my doors, That afternoon, I went to the hardware store and bought new deadbolts for all my doors, motion sensor lights for my yard, and a basic security camera system. I also made sure to check every lock twice before going to bed that night. For the next week, everything seemed normal. The cameras showed nothing but the occasional cat or raccoon wandering through my yard, and I started to relax. Maybe it had been a one-time thing, a drunk person who'd gotten confused and wandered into the wrong house. Then it happened again. I woke up on a Wednesday morning to find my back door standing wide open. Not just unlocked, but actually open, with cold October air flowing into my kitchen. The security camera that covered my back door showed nothing. Whoever had opened it had somehow avoided the camera's field of view. But this time, they'd left more than just footprints. On my kitchen counter was a half-eaten sandwich and an empty glass of milk. Someone had made themselves comfortable in my kitchen, prepared a meal, and eaten it while I slept upstairs. The bread they'd used was from my refrigerator, but it was made with ingredients I didn't have. There was mustard on the sandwich, and I don't keep mustard in my house. That meant whoever was doing this had brought their own condiments. I was starting to panic. This wasn't random. Someone was deliberately targeting my house, and they were getting bolder. I called the police again, but the response was basically the same. Without evidence of who was doing it or how they were getting in, there wasn't much they could investigate. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed additional cameras to cover every possible entrance to my house, and I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. I also began setting small traps, pieces of tape on doors and windows that would be disturbed if someone opened them. And I started taking photos of how I left things before going to bed so I could tell if anything had been moved. The traps worked. Over the next few days, I found evidence that someone was still getting into my house, but I couldn't figure out how. The cameras showed nothing. The doors and windows remained locked, but my tape traps were consistently disturbed. Then I discovered something that changed everything. I was reviewing the footage from my cameras one morning when I noticed something odd. At 3:17 a.m., one of my interior cameras had captured movement in my living room. But it wasn't a stranger. It was me. I watched in horror as the camera showed me walking downstairs in my pajamas, moving through my house like I was sleepwalking. I unlocked my back door, walked outside for several minutes, then came back in and went to my kitchen. The footage showed me making a sandwich, eating it, and then going back upstairs to bed. I had no memory of any of this. I immediately made an appointment with my doctor, convinced that I'd developed some kind of sleep disorder. Sleepwalking wasn't uncommon, and it would explain everything. The unlocked doors, the food, even the muddy footprints if I'd been walking outside in my sleep. But my doctor was puzzled. Adult onset sleepwalking was unusual, especially with no previous history of sleep disorders. She referred me to a sleep specialist and suggested I set up a camera in my bedroom to monitor my sleep patterns. That's when I caught him. The bedroom camera I installed showed me sleeping peacefully through the night. No sleepwalking, no getting out of bed. But at 2:45 a.m., the camera captured something that made my blood run cold. A man entered my bedroom while I was sleeping. He was wearing dark clothes and moved very quietly. But he wasn't trying to hide from the camera. He walked directly into its view and looked straight at it, like he wanted me to see him. He stood next to my bed for several minutes, just watching me sleep. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a small spray bottle. He sprayed something into the air near my face, waited a few moments, then gently shook my shoulder. I didn't wake up. He shook me harder, even lifted my arm and let it drop. I remained completely unconscious. Whatever he'd sprayed had knocked me out so deeply that I couldn't be roused. Satisfied that I was incapacitated, the man left my bedroom. The camera showed him returning about an hour later, this time carrying what appeared to be my clothes. He dressed me in jeans and a sweatshirt, then helped my unconscious body out of bed and guided me downstairs. The next part of the footage was the most disturbing. The man essentially puppeteered my unconscious body through my house, making it look like I was sleepwalking. He moved my arms and legs, positioned me in front of cameras, and even made it appear that I was making food in my kitchen. He was creating fake evidence that I was sleepwalking to cover up his break-ins. After about an hour of this sick performance, he brought me back upstairs, changed me back into my pajamas, and put me back in bed. Then he left through my back door, which he locked behind him. I watched this footage in absolute horror, realizing that I'd been drugged and manipulated multiple times without knowing it. The sleepwalking episodes I'd seen on camera weren't real. They were elaborate stagings designed to make me think I was having a medical problem instead of being victimized by an intruder. I immediately called the police and showed them the footage. This time, they took it very seriously. The video clearly showed someone breaking into my house, drugging me, and manipulating my unconscious body. It was assault, breaking and entering, and probably a dozen other crimes. The investigation moved quickly once they had video evidence. The man in the footage was identified as Robert Kellerman, a 34-year-old unemployed man who lived about 2 miles from my house. He had a history of breaking and entering, but nothing as elaborate or disturbing as what he'd done to me. When police searched his apartment, they found detailed notes about my daily routine, photos of my house taken from various angles, and most disturbingly, a collection of videos he'd taken of me while I was unconscious. Some showed him moving my body around my house, but others were more invasive. Videos of him undressing me, posing me in different positions, and doing things to my unconscious body that I don't want to think about. They also found the spray he'd been using to drug me. It was a homemade mixture of chloroform and other chemicals that he'd researched online. The concentration was strong enough to keep me unconscious for hours, but not so strong that it would kill me or leave obvious traces in my system. Robert had been breaking into my house for over 2 months before I'd started noticing anything. The muddy footprints from the first incident had been real. He'd been sloppy that night and hadn't bothered to clean up after himself. But after that, he'd developed the elaborate sleepwalking charade to throw me off the trail. During his interrogation, Robert admitted that he'd chosen my house because I lived alone and worked from home, which meant he could observe my routines easily. He'd been watching me for weeks before his first break-in, learning my schedule and figuring out the best times to enter my house. The fake sleepwalking wasn't just about covering his tracks. It was also part of his fantasy. He told police that he enjoyed the control he had over my unconscious body, and that making me think I was sleepwalking was almost as satisfying as the break-ins themselves. Robert Kellerman was sentenced to 12 years in prison for multiple counts of breaking and entering, assault, drugging, and sexual assault. The judge called his crimes particularly heinous because of the psychological manipulation involved, but knowing he's in prison doesn't undo what happened to me. I had to move out of that house. I couldn't sleep there knowing what had been done to me while I was unconscious. I also had to undergo extensive medical testing to make sure the drugs he'd used hadn't caused any permanent damage. The worst part is not knowing exactly how many times it happened. The cameras only caught him once, but based on the evidence in his apartment, he'd been drugging and manipulating me for months. How many times did he undress me? How many times did he pose my unconscious body for his sick videos? How many times did he violate me while I was helpless? I'll never know. And that uncertainty haunts me every night when I try to sleep. Sometimes, the most terrifying violations are the ones we never know happened. David learned that even in the safety of his own bedroom, even in the depths of sleep, he wasn't safe from someone who had turned home invasion into a twisted form of psychological torture. This story comes from Amanda, a 29-year-old real estate agent who thought she'd found the perfect rental property for a client. What she discovered hidden in that house still makes her question every property she shows. I've been working in real estate for about 5 years, specializing in rental properties in the suburbs outside of Chicago. It's not the most glamorous part of the business, but I enjoy helping people find homes, and the rental market has been pretty steady. Most of my clients are young professionals or small families looking for something affordable but nice. Last spring, I got a call from a property owner named Mr. Garrett, who said he had a house he wanted to put on the rental market. It was a 3-bedroom colonial in Oakwood Heights, a quiet neighborhood that was popular with families. He said he'd inherited the house from his uncle and wanted to rent it out rather than sell it. When I met Mr. Garrett at the property, I was impressed. The house was in excellent condition, recently painted, well-maintained landscaping, and updated fixtures throughout. The rent he was asking was actually below market value for the area, which I thought was strange but didn't question. Sometimes people just want reliable tenants more than maximum profit. Mr. Garrett seemed like a straightforward guy. He was probably in his 60s, well-dressed, and spoke about the property with obvious pride. He told me his uncle had lived there for over 20 years and had taken excellent care of the place. The only thing he asked was that I handle all the showings myself. He didn't want to be bothered with the day-to-day rental process. I listed the property on a Thursday, and by Friday morning, I had 6 people wanting to see it. The first showing was scheduled for Saturday afternoon with a young couple named Mike and Jennifer, who were looking for their first place together. I arrived at the house about 15 minutes early to turn on lights and make sure everything looked perfect. Mr. Garrett had given me the keys and the security code and told me I could show the property anytime during normal business hours. The house showed beautifully. Mike and Jennifer loved the open floor plan, the updated kitchen, and the large backyard. We were upstairs looking at the master bedroom when Jennifer mentioned that she thought she heard music coming from somewhere in the house. I paused and listened, but I didn't hear anything. "It's probably just the neighbors," I said, though I made a mental note to check if there was a radio or TV that might have been left on. We finished the tour, and Mike and Jennifer said they were very interested. They wanted to think about it over the weekend and get back to me on Monday. After they left, I did a quick walkthrough to make sure everything was secure before locking up. That's when I heard it too. Faint music coming from somewhere in the house. It sounded like it was coming from below me, but I was on the first floor. The house had a basement, but Mr. Garrett had told me it was just used for storage and wasn't part of the rental. I found the basement door in the kitchen. It was locked, which seemed odd since Mr. Garrett hadn't mentioned that any areas would be off limits to me as the listing agent. I tried the keys he'd given me, and one of them opened the basement door. The basement was finished, which was a nice surprise. It could have been a selling point for the rental. But as I walked down the stairs, I realized why Mr. Garrett hadn't mentioned it. The basement was set up like a small apartment. There was a bed, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a living area with a TV and stereo system. It looked like someone was living down there. My first thought was that maybe Mr. Garrett's uncle had rented out the basement separately, and there was still a tenant who hadn't been told about the change in ownership. But something felt wrong about the setup. The basement had no windows, and the only entrance was through the kitchen upstairs. It felt less like an apartment and more like a hiding place. I called Mr. Garrett immediately. When I told him what I'd found, there was a long pause before he answered. "Oh, that," he said, sounding uncomfortable. "My uncle used to rent that space out occasionally. I thought it was empty now. I'll take care of it." He asked me not to mention the basement to any potential tenants and said he'd have it cleared out within a few days. Something about his tone made me uneasy, but I agreed to keep quiet about it for now. The next showing was scheduled for Sunday morning with a single mother named Lisa, who was looking for a place for herself and her 8-year-old daughter. I arrived early again, and this time I made sure to check that the basement door was locked before the showing began. Lisa loved the house as much as Mike and Jennifer had. Her daughter, Emma, was excited about having her own room and kept running around exploring. We were in the kitchen when Emma suddenly stopped and looked at the floor. "Mommy, someone's walking around downstairs," she said. Lisa and I both froze. I could hear it too. Footsteps coming from the basement, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. "I thought you said no one else lived here," Lisa said, looking concerned. I didn't know what to say. I told her there might be a maintenance person working on something and suggested we finish the tour quickly. But the footsteps continued the entire time we were in the house, and I could tell Lisa was getting more and more uncomfortable. After they left, I stood in the kitchen listening to the sounds from below. It definitely sounded like someone was down there. But Mr. Garrett had assured me the basement would be cleared out. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. I knew I should probably leave and wait to hear back from Mr. Garrett. But I was responsible for this listing, and I needed to know what was going on. I unlocked the basement door and called down the stairs. "Hello? Is someone down there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Everything went silent. "This is Amanda from Riverside Realty. Mr. Garrett asked me to check on the basement." Still no response. I started down the stairs, my heart pounding. The basement looked exactly the same as it had the day before, but now I noticed details I'd missed. There were dirty dishes in the sink, unmade bedding on the bed, and clothes scattered around like someone had been living there recently. On the small table next to the bed, I found something that made my blood run cold. A notebook filled with handwritten entries that appeared to be observations about the people who'd been touring the house. Saturday, 2:15 p.m. Young couple, early 20s. Woman has blonde hair, about 5 feet 6 inches. Man is taller, dark hair. They liked the master bedroom. Woman mentioned wanting to start a family soon. Sunday, 10:30 a.m. Single mother with young daughter. Mother is brunette, probably early 30s. Works in marketing based on phone calls she took. Daughter is about 8, very energetic. Mother seemed nervous about security. Someone had been watching my showings. Someone had been taking notes about my clients, learning personal details about them, and recording their reactions to the house. I flipped through more pages and found entries going back weeks, describing people I'd never brought to the house. Apparently, whoever was living in the basement had been observing other real estate agents and their clients too. Tuesday, 4 p.m. Different agent, older woman. Showed house to elderly couple looking to downsize. Couple mentioned they keep large amounts of cash in their home because they don't trust banks. Friday, 1 p.m. Young professional, lives alone, works night shifts at hospital. Mentioned she's often away from home for 12+ hours at a time. The notebook was full of information that could be used to target these people. Their schedules, their vulnerabilities, their personal details. It was like someone was using the house showings to scout potential victims. I heard a sound behind me and spun around to find a man standing at the bottom of the basement stairs. He was probably in his 30s, thin and pale like he didn't get much sunlight. He was holding a camera with a long lens. "You're not supposed to be down here," he said calmly, like I was the one who was trespassing. I backed away from him, my phone already in my hand. "Who are you? What are you doing in this house?" He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "I live here. Mr. Garrett lets me stay in exchange for keeping an eye on things." Keeping an eye on what things? The people who come to look at the house. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about someone just by watching them for an hour. I realized he'd been photographing my clients during their tours. The camera in his hands probably contained pictures of Mike and Jennifer, Lisa and her daughter, and who knows how many other innocent people who'd just been looking for a place to live. "I'm calling the police," I said, starting to dial 911. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, still speaking in that unnaturally calm voice. "Mr. Garrett wouldn't like it? And you wouldn't want anything to happen to those nice people who've been looking at the house, would you?" The threat was clear. He was implying that he knew where my clients lived and that he might target them if I caused trouble. I backed toward the stairs, keeping my phone ready to call for help. "I'm leaving now, and I'm taking this listing off the market." "That's probably a good idea," he said. "But you should know that we have your information too. Your business card, your license plate number, your office address. It would be better for everyone if you just forgot what you saw here." I ran up the stairs and out of that house as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was in my car with the doors locked and the engine running. Then I called 911 and reported what I'd found. The police response was immediate and extensive. When they searched the basement, they found not just the notebook and camera, but also a sophisticated surveillance system that had been recording everyone who entered the house. There were hundreds of photos and videos of people touring the property, along with detailed files containing personal information that had been gathered about potential targets. The man in the basement was named Kevin Walsh, and he had a criminal history that included burglary, stalking, and identity theft. He'd been using the house as a base of operations to scout victims for various crimes. The fake rental listing was just a way to get people to voluntarily enter the house so he could study them. Mr. Garrett was arrested as an accomplice. It turned out he wasn't the property owner at all. He was Kevin's partner, and they'd been running this scam for over a year. They'd target houses that were temporarily vacant, set up fake rental listings, and use the showings to gather intelligence on potential victims. The investigation revealed that several of the people who toured houses listed by Mr. Garrett had later been burglarized or had their identities stolen. The criminals had used the information gathered during house tours to plan their crimes, knowing when people would be away from home and what valuables they might have. I had to contact every client I'd shown the house to and warn them that their personal information might have been compromised. Most of them were understanding, but a few were angry that I'd put them in danger. I couldn't blame them. I felt terrible that I'd unknowingly exposed them to criminals. The experience changed how I approach my job. Now I always verify property ownership independently. I never show a property alone. and I'm much more careful about the personal information my clients share during tours. I also trust my instincts more. If something feels off about a property or a client, I don't ignore that feeling anymore. Kevin Walsh and his partner were sentenced to several years in prison for their crimes. But knowing they're locked up doesn't erase the violation I felt when I realized how they'd been using me and my clients. They'd turned something as innocent as house hunting into a way to prey on people. And they'd made me an unwitting accomplice in their schemes. I still work in real estate, but I'll never again assume that a property listing is exactly what it appears to be. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones who hide behind legitimate-seeming businesses, using our trust and our routines against us. This story comes from Tyler, a 24-year-old graduate student who lived alone in a small apartment complex near his university in Austin, Texas. What started as a simple late-night grocery trip turned into a terrifying discovery about who had been living in his apartment while he was away. I've always been a night owl. Working on my master's thesis in computer science meant I kept weird hours, often staying up until 3 or 4 a.m. coding or writing, then sleeping until noon. It wasn't the healthiest schedule, but it worked for my lifestyle and my academic workload. My apartment was a small one-bedroom unit in a complex that catered mostly to graduate students and young professionals. It wasn't fancy, but it was affordable and close to campus. The building was about 10 years old, with decent security and a pretty quiet tenant population. Most of my neighbors were like me, busy with school or work, keeping to themselves. I'd been living there for about 8 months when I started noticing small things that seemed off. At first, it was just minor stuff that I attributed to my own absent-mindedness. I'd come home from the library and find a light on that I was sure I'd turned off. Or I'd notice that items in my kitchen had been moved slightly. My coffee mug would be on the opposite side of the sink, or the salt and pepper shakers would be in different positions. Since I was often working late and functioning on very little sleep, I figured I was just forgetting things. Graduate school stress can mess with your memory, and I was definitely under a lot of pressure to finish my thesis. But then I started noticing food disappearing. Not entire meals, but small amounts that were hard to pinpoint. A loaf of bread would seem to have fewer slices than I remembered. A container of leftover pizza would feel lighter. A gallon of milk would be nearly empty when I was sure it had been half full the day before. Again, I rationalized it. Maybe I was eating more than I thought, or maybe I was just bad at estimating how much food I had left. I was often so focused on my work that I'd eat without really paying attention. The first time I really knew something was wrong was on a Tuesday night in late September. I'd been working on my thesis all evening and realized around 11 p.m. that I was completely out of food. My refrigerator was empty except for some condiments and a few energy drinks. I decided to make a quick run to the 24-hour grocery store about 10 minutes from my apartment. I grabbed my keys and wallet and headed out, planning to pick up enough food for the next few days. The grocery store was nearly empty at that hour, just a few other night owls and shift workers picking up essentials. I grabbed a cart and went through the aisles, picking up bread, milk, sandwich meat, some frozen dinners, and other basics. The whole trip took maybe 30 minutes. When I got back to my apartment complex, I noticed that the light in my living room window was on. That struck me as odd because I was pretty sure I'd turned off all the lights before leaving. But I figured maybe I'd left it on without thinking about it. I parked in my assigned spot and gathered my grocery bags from the trunk. As I was walking toward the building entrance, I happened to glance up at my apartment window again. what I saw made me freeze in place. There was a silhouette moving around in my living room. A person was walking back and forth in front of the window, clearly visible from the parking lot. My first thought was that I'd been robbed, and the burglar was still in my apartment. I set down my grocery bags and pulled out my phone to call 911. But as I was dialing, I realized something that made the situation even more disturbing. The person in my apartment wasn't moving around frantically like a burglar would. They were moving casually, comfortably, like they belonged there. I watched as the silhouette sat down on my couch and appeared to turn on my TV. Someone was making themselves at home in my apartment. I called 911 and explained the situation to the dispatcher. They said they'd send officers immediately and told me to stay outside and away from the building until they arrived. While I waited, I kept watching my apartment window. The person inside seemed completely relaxed, occasionally getting up and moving around, but never in a hurried or suspicious way. At one point, I saw them walk toward what I knew was my kitchen, and they stayed there for several minutes. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. 2 patrol cars with 4 officers. I met them in the parking lot and explained what I'd seen. They asked for my keys and told me to wait outside while they checked the apartment. I watched from the parking lot as the officers entered the building. A few minutes later, I saw flashlight beams moving around in my apartment. Then everything went dark, and one of the officers came back down to talk to me. "There's no one in your apartment now," he said, "but we found evidence that someone was definitely there." He led me upstairs to my apartment, where the other officers were waiting. What they showed me was disturbing and confusing. My apartment looked mostly normal, but there were clear signs that someone had been living there. In my kitchen, there were dirty dishes in the sink that I definitely hadn't left there. Someone had made a sandwich using my bread and lunch meat, and there were crumbs on the counter. In my living room, the TV was still warm, indicating it had been on recently. The couch cushions were arranged differently than I'd left them, and there was an indentation in one of the cushions, like someone had been sitting there for a while. Most disturbing was what they found in my bedroom. My bed had been slept in. The covers were pulled back, and the pillows showed a clear head impression. Someone had been sleeping in my bed while I was out, but there was no sign of forced entry. All my windows were locked from the inside, and my front door showed no evidence of being picked or damaged. Whoever had been in my apartment had gotten in some other way, or they had a key. The officers took a report and dusted for fingerprints, but they didn't find anything useful. They suggested I change my locks immediately and consider installing a security system. After the police left, I was too shaken to sleep in my apartment. I gathered some clothes and went to stay with a friend for the night. The next morning, I had a locksmith come out and change all my locks, and I also had him install additional deadbolts and a chain lock. I thought that would solve the problem, but I was wrong. 3 days later, I came home from the library around 10 p.m. to find evidence that someone had been in my apartment again. This time, they'd been more careful. No lights left on, no obvious signs of their presence. But I could tell someone had been there. My computer had been moved slightly on my desk. The browser history showed websites I'd never visited. Someone had been using my laptop while I was gone. In my kitchen, I found a coffee mug in the dishwasher that I was certain I hadn't put there. It was clean, but it was a mug I rarely used, and I always hand-washed my dishes anyway. Most unsettling was what I found in my bathroom. There was a damp towel hanging on the rack, not soaking wet, but definitely damp, like someone had used it recently. I lived alone and hadn't showered since that morning, so there was no reason for any towel to be damp. I called the police again, but without evidence of forced entry or anything stolen, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I install security cameras to try to catch whoever was getting into my apartment. That weekend, I set up a basic camera system with motion detection that would send alerts to my phone. I placed cameras in my living room, kitchen, and bedroom, and I made sure they were hidden well enough that an intruder wouldn't immediately notice them. The cameras didn't catch anything for the first week. I started to think that maybe the new locks had solved the problem, or that whoever had been getting in had been scared off by the police visits. Then, on a Thursday afternoon while I was in class, I got a motion alert on my phone. I opened the app and watched in real time as someone moved around my apartment. It was a woman, probably in her 30s, with dark hair and wearing casual clothes. She moved through my apartment like she was completely comfortable there, going to my kitchen and making herself something to eat, then sitting on my couch and turning on my TV. I was sitting in the middle of a lecture, watching a stranger make herself at home in my apartment. I quietly gathered my things and left class, calling 911 as I walked to my car. By the time I got home with the police, she was gone. But the cameras had recorded everything, and what I saw when I reviewed the footage was even more disturbing than I'd expected. The woman had entered my apartment using a key. She walked right up to my front door, unlocked it, and came inside like she belonged there. She knew exactly where everything was. She went straight to my kitchen, knew which cabinet contained the glasses, and even knew where I kept my snacks. She spent about 2 hours in my apartment, during which time she ate my food, watched my TV, used my bathroom, and even took a nap on my couch. Before leaving, she cleaned up after herself, washing the dishes she'd used and making sure everything looked normal. The most chilling part was that she clearly knew my schedule. She'd arrived shortly after I left for class and left well before I usually came home. This wasn't random. She'd been watching me, learning my routines. The police were able to identify her from the camera footage. Her name was Patricia Vance, and she was a former tenant of my apartment. She'd lived there about 2 years earlier, before I'd moved in. When they arrested her, they found that she still had a key to my apartment. Apparently, when she'd moved out, she'd made a copy of her key before returning the original to the landlord. She'd been using that key to enter my apartment whenever she wanted. During her interrogation, Patricia admitted that she'd been coming to my apartment regularly for months. She said she missed living there and that it felt like home to her. She claimed she wasn't trying to hurt me or steal anything. She just wanted to spend time in the place where she'd been happy. But the investigation revealed something much more disturbing. Patricia had been essentially living a double life, splitting her time between her current apartment across town and my apartment. She'd been eating my food, using my utilities, and treating my home like it was still hers. She'd also been going through my personal belongings, reading my mail, and even accessing my computer. The police found evidence that she'd been monitoring my email and social media accounts, learning intimate details about my life. Patricia was charged with breaking and entering, stalking, and identity theft. She was also required to undergo psychological evaluation, as her behavior suggested serious mental health issues. The landlord was horrified when he learned what had happened. He immediately changed the policy for key returns and implemented a system to ensure that all locks were changed between tenants. He also offered to move me to a different unit at no charge. I decided to take him up on that offer. Even though Patricia was in jail, I couldn't feel safe in that apartment knowing she'd been living there alongside me for months. The thought of her sleeping in my bed, using my shower, and going through my personal things made me sick. The experience taught me to pay attention to those small signs that something isn't right. The moved objects, the missing food, the damp towels. They weren't products of my imagination or stress. They were evidence that my privacy was being violated in the most intimate way possible. I also learned that just because someone doesn't live somewhere anymore doesn't mean they've really left. Sometimes the most dangerous intruders are the ones who feel like they have a right to be there. This story comes from Claire, a 32-year-old marketing executive who thought she'd found the perfect vacation rental through a house swap website. What she discovered in that seemingly idyllic home turned her dream getaway into a living nightmare. I've always loved the idea of house swapping for vacations. It's more affordable than hotels. You get to experience living like a local. And there's something appealing about staying in someone's actual home rather than a sterile hotel room. I'd done it successfully twice before, once in Portland and once in San Diego. And both experiences had been wonderful. When I found the listing for a house in Asheville, North Carolina, I knew it was perfect for the week-long solo retreat I'd been planning. The photos showed a beautiful craftsman-style home nestled in the mountains, with a wraparound porch, a cozy fireplace, and stunning views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The owner, a woman named Linda Morrison, seemed lovely in our email exchanges and was enthusiastic about swapping her mountain retreat for my downtown Chicago condo. Linda explained that she was an artist who used the house as a creative retreat, but she was excited to spend a week in the city visiting museums and galleries. We exchanged references, photos of our respective homes, and detailed instructions about everything from Wi-Fi passwords to quirky door handles. I arrived at Linda's house on a Sunday afternoon in early October, when the fall foliage was at its peak. The house was even more beautiful in person than in the photos, a perfect blend of rustic charm and modern amenities. Linda had left a welcome basket with local wine and homemade cookies, along with a handwritten note suggesting hiking trails and restaurants in the area. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent my mornings hiking in the nearby national forest, my afternoons reading on the porch, and my evenings cooking in Linda's well-equipped kitchen. It was the perfect escape from my stressful job and the chaos of city life. The house felt lived in and comfortable, filled with Linda's artwork and personal touches that made it feel warm and welcoming. There were paintings on every wall, sculptures on the mantelpiece, and books scattered throughout that reflected her artistic interests. On Wednesday evening, I was looking for a corkscrew to open a bottle of wine when I noticed something odd in one of the kitchen drawers. Mixed in with the usual kitchen utensils was a small key that looked like it belonged to a padlock. It seemed out of place among the spatulas and measuring spoons, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Later that evening, I was exploring the house more thoroughly when I found a door I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away under the staircase, painted the same color as the wall, which made it almost invisible unless you were looking for it. When I tried the handle, I found it was locked. I remembered the small key I'd found in the kitchen drawer and went to get it. Sure enough, it fit the lock perfectly. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading down to what appeared to be a basement. I could see a light switch at the top of the stairs, so I flipped it on and started down. What I found in that basement changed everything. The space had been converted into what looked like a photography studio, but not the kind you'd expect from a landscape artist like Linda claimed to be. The walls were covered with photographs, but they weren't artistic nature shots or mountain landscapes. They were surveillance photos of people in their homes, hundreds of them, organized in neat rows and labeled with names, dates, and addresses. Photos of families eating dinner, people watching TV, couples sleeping in their beds. All taken from outside, through windows, with telephoto lenses that captured intimate moments when people thought they were alone and safe. I moved closer to examine the photos more carefully, and my blood ran cold when I realized what I was looking at. These weren't random surveillance photos. They were organized by house swap locations. There was a section labeled Portland House Swap, March 2023, with dozens of photos of a family I didn't recognize. But the house in the background was definitely the same Portland home where I'd stayed during my first house swap experience. Another section was labeled San Diego House Swap, July 2023, and contained photos of the actual homeowners of the San Diego house where I'd stayed just a few months earlier. Photos of them in their backyard, through their kitchen window, even what appeared to be shots taken from inside their house while they were sleeping. But the section that made me feel physically sick was labeled Chicago House Swap, October 2023. This week. It contained photos of my own apartment building, my windows, and even shots of me that had clearly been taken before I'd left for this trip. Linda Morrison wasn't just an artist looking for a city vacation. She was a stalker who used house swapping as a way to gain access to people's homes and lives. I found a desk in the corner of the basement with a computer and several notebooks. The notebooks contained detailed information about house swap hosts, their schedules, their habits, their personal information, and disturbingly intimate observations about their daily routines. One notebook was dedicated entirely to me. It contained information about my job, my address, my car, and even details about my personal life that she could only have learned by going through my belongings or accessing my personal accounts. Bust. Claire works long hours, usually doesn't get home until after 7 p.m. Lives alone, no pets. Keeps spare key under fake rock by front door. Bedroom faces east, gets morning sun. Sleeps on left side of bed. Takes sleeping pills, bottle in bathroom medicine cabinet. The entries went on for pages, documenting everything from my grocery shopping habits to my exercise routine. She'd been planning this house swap for months, gathering intelligence about me and my life. But the most terrifying discovery was a folder labeled Access Plans. It contained detailed floor plans of houses she'd stayed in, including my apartment. She'd drawn maps showing entry points, security systems, and even the locations of valuable items. There were also keys, dozens of them, labeled with addresses that corresponded to her previous house swaps. She'd been making copies of keys from every house she'd stayed in, giving herself permanent access to the homes of unsuspecting house swap hosts. I found my own spare key in the collection, the one I'd told her was hidden under the fake rock by my front door. She'd made a copy before leaving Chicago. My hands were shaking as I realized the full scope of what Linda was doing. She wasn't just violating people's privacy during house swaps. She was setting up long-term surveillance and access to their homes. She could return to any of these houses whenever she wanted, and the owners would never know. I heard a car door slam outside, and my heart stopped. I quickly turned off the basement light and crept up the stairs, locking the door behind me and replacing the key in the kitchen drawer. Through the front window, I could see a car in the driveway. Linda had come back early. I tried to act normal as she came through the front door, but my mind was racing. She greeted me with a warm smile and said, She'd decided to cut her city trip short because she was homesick for the mountains. "How has your stay been?" she asked, setting down her bags. "I hope you've been comfortable." "It's been wonderful," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strained, even to me. "The house is beautiful." She studied my face carefully, and I had the unsettling feeling that she could tell something was wrong. "You look a little pale. Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired from hiking," I lied. "I think I'll head to bed early tonight." "Of course. Make yourself at home." The way she said, "make yourself at home," sent chills down my spine. I knew now that she'd been making herself at home in other people's houses for years, violating their privacy and security in the most intimate ways possible. I went upstairs to the guest room where I'd been staying, but I didn't sleep. Instead, I quietly packed my belongings and waited until I heard Linda go to bed. Then I crept downstairs, grabbed my car keys, and left as quietly as possible. I drove straight to the local police station and reported what I'd found. The officers were initially skeptical. House-swapping disputes weren't exactly common. But when I described the basement photography studio and the surveillance equipment, they took it much more seriously. They obtained a search warrant and raided Linda's house the next morning. What they found was even worse than what I'd discovered. In addition to the surveillance photos and copied keys, they found evidence that Linda had been selling information about house swap hosts to burglars and other criminals. She'd been using the house swap platform to scout potential targets, gathering detailed intelligence about their homes, schedules, and valuables. Then selling that information to people who would use it to commit crimes. The investigation revealed that several of Linda's previous house swap hosts had been burglarized within months of hosting her. The burglars had known exactly when the homeowners would be away, which items were most valuable, and how to get into the houses without triggering security systems. Linda Morrison was arrested and charged with multiple counts of stalking, breaking and entering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit burglary. The investigation expanded to include law enforcement agencies in several states, where she'd conducted house swaps. The house swap platform immediately suspended her account and implemented new security measures to try to prevent similar situations. But the damage was already done. Dozens of innocent people had had their privacy violated and their homes compromised. I had to change all my locks, install a comprehensive security system, and even consider moving to a new apartment. The thought that Linda had been in my home, going through my personal belongings and documenting my private life, made me feel violated in a way I'd never experienced before. The experience destroyed my trust in house swapping and made me much more cautious about sharing personal information with strangers. I'd learned that predators can hide behind any kind of legitimate-seeming activity, and that sometimes the people who seem most trustworthy are the ones you should fear most. Linda Morrison was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but knowing she's locked up doesn't erase the violation I felt when I realized how she'd been using my trust against me. She'd turned something as innocent as a vacation rental into a way to prey on people. And she'd made me an unwitting victim of her elaborate surveillance operation. I still travel, but I stick to hotels now. The idea of staying in someone else's home or letting a stranger stay in mine fills me with anxiety, because I learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who come into your life disguised as friends. This story comes from Kevin, a 25-year-old teacher who moved into what seemed like the perfect apartment complex in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. What he discovered about his building manager turned his dream home into a nightmare that made him question everyone in a position of trust. I'd been looking for an apartment for months when I found Sunset Gardens. It was a small complex with only 24 units, built around a central courtyard with a pool and well-maintained landscaping. The rent was reasonable. The location was perfect for my commute to the elementary school where I taught. And the apartment manager, Frank Delacroix, seemed like a genuinely nice guy. Frank was probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and the kind of friendly demeanor that made you feel like you'd known him for years. During my initial tour, he told me he'd been managing the property for over 8 years and took pride in maintaining a quiet, safe community for his tenants. He knew everyone by name, kept track of their schedules, and seemed genuinely invested in making sure everyone was happy. The apartment itself was perfect for my needs, a 1-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor with a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Frank explained that he lived in the manager's unit on the ground floor, which made him available for any maintenance issues or emergencies. He gave me his personal cell phone number and told me to call anytime if I needed anything. I moved in on a Saturday in late August, and Frank was incredibly helpful. He helped me carry boxes, showed me where everything was located, and even brought me a welcome basket with snacks and a bottle of wine. He introduced me to several of my neighbors, all of whom seemed to genuinely like and respect him. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. Frank was responsive to any maintenance requests. The building was quiet and well-maintained, and my neighbors were friendly. I felt like I'd found the ideal living situation. The first sign that something might be wrong came about a month after I'd moved in. I was grading papers late one evening when I heard what sounded like someone walking around on my balcony. I looked outside but didn't see anyone. The balcony was small and there was nowhere for someone to hide, so I figured it must have been a cat or maybe something falling from the tree that overhung part of the building. But then I heard it again the next night and the night after that. Always around the same time, between 11 p.m. and midnight, and always the same pattern of footsteps moving slowly across my balcony. I mentioned it to Frank when I saw him in the courtyard a few days later. He looked concerned and said he'd check to see if there were any maintenance issues with the balcony structure that might be causing settling sounds. He also said he'd keep an eye out for anyone who might be accessing the balconies inappropriately. "You know, Kevin," he said, "I take the security of this building very seriously. Everyone here is like family to me, and I want to make sure you all feel safe." His concern seemed genuine, and I appreciated that he was taking my complaints seriously. But the footsteps continued, and I started to notice other things that seemed off. Sometimes I'd come home from work to find that items in my apartment had been moved slightly. My coffee mug would be on the opposite side of the sink from where I'd left it. Books on my coffee table would be in a different order. The throw pillow on my couch would be positioned differently. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid or forgetful. Teaching elementary school is exhausting, and I was often tired enough that I might not remember exactly how I'd left things. But the changes were consistent and subtle, like someone was trying to cover their tracks but wasn't quite careful enough. I also started noticing that Frank seemed to know more about my schedule than I'd ever told him. He'd make casual comments about when I left for work or when I came home, mentioning details that suggested he was paying very close attention to my comings and goings. "You were out late last night," he'd say when I ran into him in the morning. "I hope you had a good time." Or, "I noticed you didn't come home until after 7 p.m. yesterday. Long day at school." These comments always seemed friendly and neighborly, but they started to make me uncomfortable. How did he know exactly when I came and went? Was he watching my apartment that closely? The situation escalated on a Friday night in October. I'd gone out to dinner with some colleagues and came home around 10 p.m. to find my apartment door unlocked. I was absolutely certain I'd locked it when I left. I'm obsessive about checking locks. But when I turned the handle, it opened immediately. I called Frank immediately, thinking there might have been a maintenance emergency that required him to enter my apartment. He answered on the first ring and sounded surprised to hear from me. "I haven't been in your apartment today, Kevin," he said. "Are you sure you locked the door when you left?" I told him I was positive, and he said he'd come up to check things out. When he arrived, he did a thorough walkthrough of my apartment, checking all the windows and looking for any signs of forced entry. Everything seemed normal. Nothing appeared to be missing. "Maybe you were distracted when you left," he suggested. "It happens to everyone sometimes." But I knew I'd locked that door. I started to wonder if someone else in the building had a key to my apartment, or if there was some kind of security issue Frank wasn't telling me about. That night, I decided to set up a simple test. Before going to bed, I placed a small piece of tape on my front door frame in a spot where it wouldn't be noticed unless someone was looking for it. If anyone opened my door while I was asleep, the tape would be disturbed. The next morning, the tape was gone. Someone had entered my apartment while I slept, and they'd been careful enough to remove the tape to cover their tracks. I was terrified and furious. I called Frank immediately and demanded to know who else had keys to my apartment. "Only myself and the property owner," he said. "And I can assure you that neither of us has been in your apartment without your permission." I told him about the tape test, and he seemed genuinely shocked. He said he'd contact the property owner immediately and suggested I file a police report. The police came out that afternoon and took a report. But without evidence of forced entry or theft, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I change my locks and install a security camera. Frank offered to have the locks changed at no charge, saying the property management company would cover the cost since there seemed to be a security issue. He also said he'd install additional lighting in the hallway and increase his security patrols of the building. I felt better after the locks were changed, but I also decided to install a small security camera in my living room that I could monitor from my phone. If someone was getting into my apartment, I was going to catch them. The camera didn't show anything for the first week. I started to think that maybe the lock change had solved the problem, or that whoever had been entering my apartment had been scared off by the police visit. Then, on a Tuesday night while I was at a school board meeting, I got a motion alert on my phone. I opened the app and watched in real time as someone entered my apartment using a key. It was Frank. I watched in horror as my trusted building manager walked casually through my apartment like he owned the place. He went to my kitchen and opened my refrigerator, helping himself to a drink. Then he sat down on my couch and turned on my TV, making himself completely at home. But what he did next made me feel sick. He got up and walked into my bedroom, where he spent several minutes going through my dresser drawers and closet. He held up some of my clothes, examining them closely, and even took photos of some items with his phone. Then he went into my bathroom and opened my medicine cabinet, photographing the contents. He also went through my laundry hamper, pulling out dirty clothes and holding them up to his face. I was sitting in a school board meeting, watching my building manager violate my privacy in the most intimate ways possible. I quietly left the meeting and called 911 from my car. By the time I got home with the police, Frank was gone. But the camera had recorded everything. and the footage clearly showed him using a key to enter my apartment and then systematically going through my personal belongings. When the police confronted Frank at his apartment, he initially denied everything. But when they showed him the video footage, he broke down and confessed. What he told them was even more disturbing than what I'd witnessed on camera. Frank had been entering tenants' apartments regularly for years, using his master keys to access their homes whenever they were away. He'd been going through their personal belongings, taking photos of their private items, and in some cases, stealing small personal items that he thought wouldn't be missed. He had a collection of hundreds of photos taken inside tenants' apartments, showing their personal belongings, their private spaces, and even intimate items from their bedrooms and bathrooms. He'd also collected small souvenirs from each apartment. Pieces of jewelry, underwear, personal photos, and other items that had sentimental value to their owners. The investigation revealed that Frank had been targeting single tenants, particularly young women and men who lived alone. He'd been using his position as building manager to learn their schedules, access their apartments, and violate their privacy in ways they never suspected. Several other tenants came forward with stories similar to mine. Items that had been moved, the feeling that someone had been in their apartments, and Frank's unsettling knowledge of their personal schedules and habits. One tenant, a young woman named Sarah, said she'd always felt uncomfortable with how much Frank seemed to know about her life. But she'd attributed it to him being a conscientious building manager. She'd never suspected that he was regularly entering her apartment and going through her personal belongings. Another tenant found that some of her jewelry had gone missing over the months, but she'd assumed she'd misplaced it. When police searched Frank's apartment, they found her missing items along with personal belongings stolen from other tenants. Frank Delacroix was arrested and charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering, theft, and invasion of privacy. He was also charged with voyeurism after police found evidence that he'd been taking photos of tenants in their private moments. The property management company fired him immediately and offered to relocate all affected tenants to other properties at no charge. They also implemented new policies requiring background checks for all employees and limiting master key access. But the damage was already done. Frank had violated the trust and privacy of dozens of tenants over the years, using his position of authority to prey on the people he was supposed to protect. I moved out of Sunset Gardens within a week of Frank's arrest. I couldn't stay in an apartment that he'd violated so many times, knowing that he'd been going through my personal belongings and photographing my private spaces. The experience taught me that predators can hide behind any position of trust and authority. Frank had seemed like the perfect building manager, helpful, friendly, and genuinely concerned about his tenants' welfare. But he'd been using that trust to gain access to our most private spaces and violate our sense of security in our own homes. Frank was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but that doesn't undo the violation that his tenants experienced. We'd trusted him with our safety and security, and he'd used that trust to prey on us in ways we never could have imagined. I'm much more cautious now about who I trust with access to my home. I've learned that sometimes the people who seem most trustworthy are the ones who pose the greatest danger, because they're the ones we never suspect.